Hi. So over the last couple of days, I actually tested a lot of things with ChatGPT. In particular, I was looking at the kind of output it generates when you're trying to build a software product from scratch. So what I'm going to do is switch between this slide and essentially the output on ChatGPT. And this video will essentially capture my views on how I think ChatGPT is going to essentially impact the way we do software development. So this is essentially a very high-level summary of the observations, right? So I looked at 5 different categories. Essentially, one first is, and this is mirrors the way we do software development, right? You start with a product spec, then you do a system design, then you implement, then you test, and then you essentially deploy and manage it. So essentially, at a very high level, right? ChatGPT is able to create very good product specs. So the value there is high. And essentially, the impact there is that you can get PRDs pretty automated, and you actually don't need a lot of junior PMs. The risk is that if you use too much of ChatGPT, chances are you not get that marination time to generate innovative ideas. Now, coming to system design, for system design, I did not find ChatGPT very useful. The best it can do is help you in documentation because it essentially misses out on your context and it makes generic choices. And I think part of the reason is also because a lot of system design is not available as text documents, and potentially the reason it's kind of a weak point for ChatGPT. Implementation actually does a pretty good job for standard kind of services that you want to implement, and we'll look at some of the services like pricing. And it actually churns out good code. It may not follow your coding conventions, and that you'll have to do some tweaking around that. But that's essentially, you can actually churn out a lot of code directly using uh, ChatGPT. Of course, there's a risk that if you start to use ChatGPT extensively and you lose the ability to write and debug code, then when you have to actually write code which is complex enough for ChatGPT to not work, you may actually take more time. Testing, I did not find very good tests that were generated by ChatGPT. And part of the reason is simply because I think in their repo, they really don't have a lot of unit tests that can help them. And if you look at the way a program operates, figuring out all the edge cases is not a problem that you can solve using standard sequence to sequence or transformers kind of approach. And that's essentially why testing is not really that great. In the DevOps, it's mixed. The code generation for infrastructure as automation, it actually works well. But since it is just going to generate some text, stuff that actually requires integration, which is operations and deployment, will not probably see a lot of impact. The risk again here would be if you just use ChatGPT, then your own ability to write code will probably diminish over time. So at this point, what I'm going to do is jump to ChatGPT and essentially show you what it generated for some things. So let's get here. So yeah, so this is basically what I wanted it to do in terms of generate a PRD for a pricing system. And I gave it some early hints on what kind of pricing system I'm looking for, essentially a rule-based system, where the pricing can change based on the product and the user. And so this is what it does. It gave me a good overview and essentially says the price of product for a specific user. So it took my inputs into account. The rules can be based on the attributes of the product and the user and can specify discounts or surcharges. So it does get all of that. And then it generates a bunch of user stories. It very clearly says that this one user story is essentially someone should be able to define the pricing rules using a simple grammar. Uh, they should be able to save the pricing rules in a configuration so that can easily deploy and update the rules. And then as a platform user, actually the pricing becoming activated. So it does cover the user stories well. Now let's look at the requirements. These are the same requirements I gave it, that I want to reduce the price by percentage and fixed amount. So it actually does documents that well. And then the pricing system, these are the things that it generated itself. It supports the following comparison operators: equal to, not equal to, greater than, less than, and so on and so forth. It supports rules that are conjunction of multiple conditions. This is again something that I actually had to guide it. It initially gave pricing system with a single condition, but it was a minor change, and it actually said, okay, yeah, multiple conditions and parsing rules and stuff like that. And it very clearly says conjunction is required, distinction is not required, so it's non-requirement. So that's something it actually figured out by itself. Uh, Dependencies, basically product and user classes need to have those attributes that essentially are going to be the input. So it does get that. And then it has a bunch of acceptance criteria. So see, this is not a very, very detailed PRD, but if you look at a lot of companies, the kind of PRDs you get, this is actually good enough. So that's essentially how it generated it. And now let's look at the way I actually asked it to generate some of the code. So this was the initial input I gave on, I wanted a pricing system. It actually gave me 4 options: tiered pricing, dynamic pricing, promotions and coupons, and subscription pricing. I told it to essentially implement tiered pricing, and now it generates the first piece of code. Now this code is in Python, which was fine. I can read Python. I need it in Java, but at this time I did not change the language. And it gives me a very good explanation. Now, the problem here, of course, as you can see, is that it actually hard-coded the pricing logic. And this is something that ideally I would have wished it got it itself, right? The pricing rules will change and you cannot really go and hard-code it. But once I told it that essentially I want the pricing rules not to be hard-coded, then it actually did that. It essentially used the PyParsing library, defined the grammar, and that's pretty much it. That it was able to do that. The problem here was that it actually created conditions with a single rule. And I wanted to do this in Java, so I asked it to do this in Java. It did something very similar, and in this case, it essentially created a pricing system. Now I essentially asked it to create a conjunction of such rules, and it actually generated a conjunction, but it generated a conjunction where conjunction is not on conditions, but conjunction is on rules. So as you can see, right, a rule can contain other rules. This is not what I wanted. I wanted it to have a rule which is a conjunction of conditions and a single action. It's almost like I wanted it to give a rule saying if user dot type is equal to new and product dot type equals sunscreen, then apply a 10% discount. Instead, what it did was it said create a rule which says user dot type equals to new, then do an and with something else. And then the and with something else was if user product.type equals sunscreen, then apply a 10% discount. So this was not a good intuitive way to do this. So in terms of the design part, it's actually lacking. And so I actually told it to basically, I would like the rule to be a conjunction of conditions and a single action. And this time it gets it. It basically says a rule is a list of conditions and the conditions are a conjunction and there's an action. And that's what it does. The condition it actually gets correctly. Condition can have a product attribute, user attribute, a comparison operator, and a value. And with the list of conditions, you can actually do the rule that I was talking about, which is user to type equals to new and product type equals sunscreen, then apply a 10% discount. So this is essentially the code it generated, and this is the configuration file it generated, and this is all good. But I told it that uh, because it's a rule grammar, can I actually use Antler? And yes, it said yes, you can use Antler, and it actually generated the Antler file for me, which is exactly the same that it had generated as a JSON configuration. So it does get all of this, and you can essentially guide it to say, okay, so if I have to summarize this, I started by saying give me a pricing system. It gave me something which is a simple condition. Then it gave me a way to have conjunction of conditions, but not in the way that I would have liked. But once I guided it again, it actually was able to give me what I wanted. And it's able to give me pretty good code. And then I asked it to build a REST API on top of this because, see, this is just logic and I want to expose this as an API. And essentially it built that API using Spring. And then I asked it to build it using Spring Boot, and I made a typo here. But it gets it, and it essentially creates a Spring Boot application. But the challenge, as you can see, is that it doesn't follow the convention, one of the standard convention that you have as a controller calls a service class, it serves as a service implementation, and so on and so forth. So those are the things that I'm sure if you guide it, it will do it. Otherwise, also, if you stick with this convention, it's not a bad thing. All code in one convention is all you care about. And then I asked it to basically create some unit test. And this is where it actually failed badly. It just generated like one test, simply not enough. I guided it to add some additional test cases, and it added some really stupid test cases. Um, and that's where I gave up on this and say, and I just wanted to see if I can actually ask it to write different kinds of code using different kinds of patterns. And I told it to write using lambdas, and it essentially created a functional version of the code. So it does get that. Uh, as for the implementation is concerned, you can actually guide it to implement it in the way you like. But as far as tests are concerned, essentially not doing a very great job. So now if I go back to what we essentially learned out of this, the product management, right, it generates good PRDs for standard requirements, like we saw in the pricing one, and then essentially offers many existing options for the problem. It cannot generate new ideas or domain-specific ideas, but it really improves the productivity of senior PMs. They can actually generate a PRD fairly quickly, may make junior PMs redundant. And essentially, if you look at the pyramid of PMs, then the bottom of the pyramid, you probably don't need so many people. The risk, of course, is that at least people who have written PRDs, or people who have written long documents, realize that when you start writing stuff, it slows you down and sometimes gives you better perspective and helps you come up with better ideas. If you use ChatGPT for writing this end to end, chances are you will miss out on that. And essentially, too much reliance on using this documentation, essentially, it's going to impact that. So, yeah, use it, but yeah, probably not all the time. System design, it actually failed unless, so pretty much every design decision that I wanted to take, I had to give it explicitly. The decisions it was taking was not what I wanted because it's not getting the context. It does help with documentation. It can generate the schemas and those things very easily. I did not show it in the slide, but I've tested it on various things and actually got that. And I think the problem is that a lot of system design is not documented. And even if it's documented, it is not available in public domain. And that's the reason. Uh, it doesn't have a lot of data to learn from. I mean, as most of you know, ChatGPT is essentially a learning-based system. It's learning by examples, essentially based on this notion of transformers. So it doesn't have a lot of its own knowledge. And if the open source repos that it is using do not have a lot of documentation of system design, then it is very hard for it to learn it. Essentially, that means even if you're using it, not many people will use it for system design, and there's a chicken and egg problem that it doesn't get a lot of information to learn from. Implementation, the code quality was good. It does make suboptimal decisions at times. And you have to communicate all important decisions before generating code. Of course, you can iterate and generate different versions of it. Doesn't work for really uncommon scenarios. That's what I've tried with a few of the things. But this is very, very good impact. As a designer or as a senior developer, you can actually do a lot more. You don't need 4 people. You can basically make your design decisions, get some code out, maybe get one person as opposed to 4, and then together both of you can actually just build the entire application together. So again, it may impact the bottom of the pyramid, junior developers who do not do design. You do not need too many of them. The big risk is that if you don't write code, again, right, coding is again like cycling. You're actually coding is not like cycling. So if you don't code for a while, your ability to read code and write code essentially reduces. So essentially, when you will end up with a scenario where ChatGPT is not able to write the code because it's uncommon, you may struggle if you just use it for all the time. But yeah, I mean, standard template style code, CRUD kind of code, all of that kind of code, definitely go ahead and do that. Plumbing code, do all of that. Those are things that will always generate. But yeah, business logic and all, try to write your own code so that you're still in touch. Testing, as you can see, test cases were really, really, really basic. And since they were so basic, it's not even a good starting point. So I mean, if I were a state, I would say, why do I even need to use it? What it generates, I anyway have to think everything about it. So let me just do it myself. Um, Again, in the terms of the future roadmap, again, I think it is weak because it doesn't have a big corpus. Essentially, it is unlikely it will improve significantly. Of course, all of this can change. But someone, right, there's a potentially good idea to combine ChatGPT with some dynamic analysis tools, and then basically you get a version that actually uses dynamic analysis to generate a lot of these automated tests, look at code coverage, generates more tests, and so on and so forth. So you can actually use ChatGPT as a tool, but as it is, it will not work. But you combine it with other tools, maybe you can actually use it in testing as well. DevOps and SRE, I think the biggest impact on site reliability, essentially ops management, essentially came from automation, where you had automated alerting system, monitoring system, all of that stuff. A lot of things were automated. So health check, things like self-heal, where basically standard issues, you automate the fix automatically. Those are the things that have already impacted site reliability teams. They have essentially made them very small now. And I don't think ChatGPT is going to make a bigger impact than that, because those are the things where it touch the system, and a lot of those things are already automated. They were simple to automate in any case. Uh, the place where ChatGPT will actually have an impact is generating infrastructure as code. I tested it with generating some of the Terraform code, and it does well. Um, but since it cannot really integrate with systems, there will be limited impact on the plumbing work. Again, unless someone combines ChatGPT with some layer on top that actually integrates it with the infrastructure, and then you may actually have a bigger impact. But again, overall, I think DevOps and SRE is again a space where there will be some impact, but not as much impact as I would expect, impacting junior product managers and essentially junior engineers, as far as implementation is concerned. That's it. Hope this was useful. Thank you.